In the following sermon by Jonathan Edwards called Sudden Conversions Are Very Often False, this is taken from the parable of the sower. And the point of Jonathan Edwards in this is that when people have a very easy time of coming to Christ without a previous work of awakening, often their conversions are false. This sermon is dedicated to the people that dislike my sermons on YouTube because you're not going to like this one either. It is particularly remarked in the text that the seed that was sown in stony places sprung up forthwith, and then the reason is given, namely, that they had no depth of earth, which implies as much as that it is a more common thing for seed to spring up very suddenly when it has no depth of earth than when it has. Seed that is sown upon a rock, where there is only a thin covering or sprinkling of earth, can't sink in, for it must lie very near the surface of the ground, and therefore it will come up quick. Seed that is buried at a suitable depth underground may be a growing some time before it appears above ground, but the seed that has so little earth can't sprout long before it comes up. Under this proposition, I would first note 2 or 3 things for the right understanding of it, and second, give the reasons of it. First, these 2 things may be noted for the right understanding of this proposition. It is not intended, but that all true conversion as to the work itself is wrought in a moment. It is ordinarily a considerable time before persons are converted, not after God has actually begun the work of conversion, but after persons are first awakened and put upon serious consideration of the state of their souls, of the misery of their present state, and of their necessity of a change, and after they first begin to seek the grace of God. When it is said in the explanation of the parable that the stony ground hearers anon with joy received the word, the meaning is they received it with joy. After it had been proposed to their consideration, they did not take much time to consider, but received and seemed to make it exceeding welcome at once without much deliberation. As to the work of conversion itself, though wrought in the heart, in which true believers are brought savingly to embrace the word, it is not a gradual work, but it is wrought at a word's speaking. As the light was in the beginning of the creation, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light in a moment. And as it was when Christ raised Lazarus from the dead, he said, "Lazarus, come forth," John 11:43. He immediately arose and came forth. Life was infused into him in a moment. There was no space of time at all in which Lazarus was neither dead nor alive, or an intermediate state between life and death, but he passed in an instant from being dead to being alive. It is not asserted nor implied in the words of the text that sudden conversions are always false. We have many instances to the contrary in the Holy Scripture. Some of the greatest and most remarkable instances of conversion we have in the whole Bible were very sudden ones, such as that of the Apostle Paul and of the jailer and many others. True conversion ordinarily is not suddenly wrought. Commonly, some considerable time is taken up after persons begin to be awakened, before they are thoroughly brought home to Christ. But yet there are some cases of exemption. For example, in times of extraordinary pouring out of the Spirit. For it is a common thing then for there to be sudden conversions. So it was in the times of the extraordinary pouring out of the Spirit that were in the apostles' days. Those conversions of so many thousands of Jerusalem, upon the pouring out of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost, seem, most of them, to have been very sudden conversions. And so were the conversions at Samaria at the preaching of Philip. And so indeed were most of the conversions that we read of in the New Testament, that were in the days of the apostles. For all that while there was an extraordinary pouring out of the Spirit of God. So it doubtless will be at the commencement of the glorious times of the Christian church that we hope for. This seems to be foretold of those times in Isaiah 66, verses 7 and 8. Before she travailed, she brought forth. Before her pain came, she was delivered of a man-child. Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day, or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. Here it is plainly foretold that there shall be multitudes suddenly converted at that day. And yet it is spoken of as a very strange and unusual thing, and as though God therein went out of the usual course of his providence for it. It is introduced thus: who has heard such things? Who has seen such things? At a time of an extraordinary pouring out of the Spirit, God is wont to go out of the usual course of his providence in many respects. At other times there are very few saved, but at such a time as that, great multitudes are brought home. At other times it is very rare that old sinners are converted, but at such a time such are brought home. At other times it is a rare thing that great men and rich men are brought home to Christ. But it is foretold that in the beginning of the glorious times of the church, there shall many rich men come in with their silver and gold, Isaiah 60 verse 9, and that many kings shall be converted, verse 10 and verse 16. And so God also at such times goes out of the ordinary course of his providence in this respect, that then are many sudden yet true saving conversions. Though this also must be noted concerning times of extraordinary pouring out of the Spirit, in which multitudes are truly converted, namely, that there are many false conversions at such times. At the time when the householder goes forth to sow his good seed, then the enemy also goes forth to sow tares among the wheat. And at the time when the blade of the wheat springs up and brings forth fruit, then appears the tares also, as in the 25th and 26th verses of the 13th chapter of Matthew. At the times when Christ has a great many converts appearing, the devil will have his amongst them. As of old, at the time when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, Satan came also among them, and also when in Egypt it was the time of the wonderful works of God, that it was also a time of the extraordinary working of the devil by the magicians, who by their enchantments mimicked the work of God. And as in the glorious times that were in Solomon's days, when his ships went to Ishur, they did not only buy gold and silver and precious stones, but also apes and peacocks, 1 Kings 10:22. So the devil himself is transformed into an angel of light, 2 Corinthians 11:14. Extraordinary spiritual showers from heaven not only produce a great many true converts, but also is the occasion of a great many hypocrites. As we see, it is commonly in the time of a very great shower of rain in the summer, which causes the grass and good fruits of the earth to grow abundantly, there is wont to come a great many mushrooms, especially in a very rich and dungy soil. They are a thing of a sudden growth. They will come up in a night, but soon wither away with the drought. They won't bear much of the heat of the sun. So it is observable that as a great rain brings forward good fruits, so it brings a great many blasted fruits. So there were many false converts in that extraordinary time of the pouring out of the Spirit in the apostles' days. The apostles in their epistles often mention them that after a little while turned away from the faith and followed after fables. Many that forsook the assemblies of the saints, that went out from them, because they indeed were not of them, 1 John 2 verse 19. Number 2. There are particular exempt instances of sudden and yet true conversions in ordinary times. They are common in extraordinary times, and there are some such instances in ordinary times, though then they are not as common, but extraordinary instances. The time of Christ's public ministry upon earth was no time of the extraordinary outpouring of the Spirit of God, but on the contrary was a very dull and dead time. But yet there were some instances of sudden conversion that were true, as particularly the conversion of the woman of Samaria seems to have been so, and also some other of Christ's disciples. But in ordinary times it commonly is otherwise. There is indeed in ordinary times a great deal of difference. Some are much longer under convictions and traveling in the wilderness before they are converted than others. But commonly persons are some time under awakening and seeking conversion before they are savingly brought home to Christ. But on the other hand, it is a common thing that false conversions are very sudden. They hear the word, and anon, that is, immediately with joy receive it. False joy and comfort is very often suddenly received. Second, I proceed to the reasons why sudden conversions are frequently false. The reasons seem to be principally these two. Number one, those that are suddenly comforted after first awakenings, they don't have the time to learn by experience what they are. Indeed, God doesn't need time to teach them. He can, if he pleases, make them sensible of their own blindness, wretchedness, and helplessness at once. He can show it to them by his word and spirit, from that wickedness and folly they have been guilty of throughout their whole lives, and from what appears in them at that instant. But yet it is God's more usual way to make use of their own experience to convince them, and to show them by what they find in themselves while under convictions, their own sinful, miserable, lost state. It is true man's experience won't do alone to convert them, but it is God's working in the soul. But yet God uses both ways. God doesn't stand in need of any means at all to accomplish his work in the soul. And when means are used, and never so proper means, and used never so thoroughly, and never so long, they will have no effect without God's blessing, the power of his Holy Spirit with means. But yet it is God's manner to make use of means, and to work in men a conviction of their own wickedness and lost estate. It is his more usual manner to make use of these means, namely, men's own experience of themselves, under awakenings, and in a way of earnest seeking salvation. In that way, God convinces them of their exceeding sinfulness, and in this way God usually convinces them of their utter impotency, of the insufficiency of their own righteousness. But those that are very suddenly comforted after they are first awakened haven't had time for such experience of themselves, by the various workings of their own hearts, and by repeated trials to help themselves by their own strength and righteousness. And therefore oftentimes it is so that the seed grows without depth of earth. There is no deep and thorough sense of their own nothingness and wickedness. They haven't had time to dig deep, and therefore they lay their foundation, as it were, on the top of the ground. They haven't descended deep into their own hearts. They imagine it may be that they believe that Christ is sufficient to save them, and so fancy themselves to be true believers, whereas they saw how guilty they are, and what a doleful condition they are in, it may be they would be far from thinking Christ sufficient then to save them. He that doesn't see his own wickedness and misery has no trial whether he can believe Christ to be a sufficient Savior to deliver him. He that is not sensible of the vastness and tempestuousness of the ocean may think a small and weak vessel sufficient to carry him over, but if he knew what the ocean was, he would think otherwise. Number 2. They that very suddenly embrace Christianity, or seemingly do so, commonly do it without a thorough consideration of the cost of being Christians. Persons, when they begin to entertain thoughts of turning to God, that they may become Christians, should, before they allow any hope that they are Christians, or before they pretend to make such a profession, set themselves seriously to consider the straightness of the gate and the narrowness of the way. They should thoroughly consider the difficulties of that which they have thoughts of engaging in, how much labor and self-denial and suffering a life of universal, persevering obedience to God's commandments may be an occasion of. They should first seriously consider what it is for them to sell all to obtain the pearl of great price, what it is for them to give up themselves to God without reserve, what it is to devote all their strength and all that they have or hope for, and their whole lives to the great business of religion. For lack of these, there are many false Christians. There are multitudes that seem to embrace Christ, that Christ will never own another day for lack of this, meaning that seem to receive the word with joy, but have no depth of earth. When it is proposed to men to build a tower, they should sit down first and count the cost, and see whether they have sufficient to finish it, and not go about suddenly without any consideration, for that is a way to fail in the enterprise. When we hear that an army is coming forth against us, we should not rashly, without any consideration, go forth to encounter them, but should first sit down and consider the number and strength of the enemy, and what strength will be requisite on our part in order to resist him. Luke 14, verses 31 and 32. Or what king, going to make war against another king, sits not down first and consults whether he will be able with 10,000 to meet him that comes against him with 20,000, or else while the other is yet a great way off, he sends an embassage and desires conditions of peace. It is true that men may get their conversion very soon and not be deceivers, as Jacob was, because God may bring it to them, as Jacob lionly said, Genesis 27, verse 36. God brought it to him. But more ordinarily, it is not so. Application. This doctrine should put such as look upon themselves to have been suddenly converted, upon strictly examining their conversion, whether it is true or not. I am very far from despising in what I have said in this to endeavor to discourage all that have had a sudden or quick conversion. I have shown plainly from the Word of God that there are many such instances in extraordinary times, and some exempt instances in extraordinary times. Nor do I make any doubt but that there are some such here that are true converts. But yet, what has been said doubtless may and ought to pull all such persons as have received comfort and hope of their good estate, very quickly after they set out in seeking salvation, upon strict examination of their conversion. A sudden conversion may have good works and evidences of being true and real, but inquire whether yours has such evidences or not, and whether it has not the evidences of a false conversion. If your conversion was sudden, yet if you had the following things, you may safely allow it. First, if the ends of length of time are obtained, if that be so, that you are convinced of your exceeding sinfulness and unworthiness as you are in yourself, if you see yourself to be all over polluted and abominable, and have that settled abiding sense that you carry about with you, that you are utterly unworthy of any mercy, and that if God should behold you out of Christ, he might justly hate you and cast you as an abominable thing out of his sight. If such a sense as this accompanies your hope, it is a good sign of your hope, whether it was a little while or a great one, before you obtained your hope. Again, if you are convinced of the utter insufficiency of all your own righteousness, and are sensible that your best performances are as filthy rags, and know that nothing that you do is worthy of God's acceptance, and have your dependence alone on free grace, and are one that is poor in spirit, that doesn't live upon your own stock, but upon Christ alone, then the end of long convictions before conversion is obtained, and the suddenness of your conversion doesn't need to be a stumbling block with you with respect to that. So if you are convinced of your own utter helplessness, and see what a poor, weak, impotent creature you are in yourself, the end of long experience of your helplessness before conversion is obtained. If you have a conviction and sense of these things upon your heart, you need not be concerned about the manner how you came by such a sense, whether it was by being held a great while under trouble and wandering long in the wilderness or not. Second, if your comfort hasn't put an end to your striving, you don't need to be afraid of it, because you strove for salvation but a little while before you obtained it. There are some that strive but a little while before they have their hope, and strive not in religion at all after, unless it be just while that common affection holds, whence they take their hope, or while the newness of their supposed circumstances affects them. When this is the case, it is to be feared whether they are not some of those that anon with joy receive the word without root in themselves, and that their hearts are the stony ground in which the seed sprang up forthwith, because they have no depth of earth. But if your comfort is not a flattering comfort, that which flatters corruption and is a pillow for your sloth, but upon experience of it you find it stirs you to go on in religion, striving in it, since your supposed conversion as well as before, this may justly encourage you to allow your hope that obtained before you had strove very long. Third, if your sense of your own sinfulness and emptiness increases since you have received comfort, this may encourage you concerning it, though you had not long any experience of it before. There are some that know more of themselves a great deal after their conversion than ever they did before. They see much of their own hearts. When they consider themselves as they are in themselves, they appear much more deformed and odious in their own sight than they did before, and they have a great deal more of a sense what poor, weak, blind, unstable, treacherous, empty creatures they are than ever they were before their conversion. And the longer they live, the more and more does such a sense of themselves increase, and they are less apt, therefore, to depend upon themselves. When it is thus with a man's hope, whether obtained suddenly or not, it is a very hopeful evidence of the goodness of his hope. Though he had not a great deal of time to know himself by experience, yet if his experience that he had now does more and more lead him into an acquaintance with himself, his hope has a contrary influence to that of a false hope. The nature of a false hope is strangely to put a stop to men's convictions of their own badness. If they had some conviction of it before, while they were under trouble, a false hope will put a stop to it. They won't learn no more of their own badness after their supposed conversion. On the contrary, they will lose what sense of it they had before, and will begin now to appear very good and lovely in their own eyes, and will be established in a very high thought of themselves. Fourth, if you find that you are indeed come to a disposition to embrace religion with all its difficulties, the suddenness of your conversion need to be no stumbling block to you. Though ordinarily men don't come to this disposition without some considerable time of consideration, yet if upon experience you find you are come to it, it is no matter how you come to it. If you go on building a tower, though you find the work heavy and very costly, and find that you have a disposition to go through with all the burden and cost of it, it is no matter you took any great while to count the cost or not. Men that go about the work suddenly and rashly, because they haven't counted the cost, commonly very suddenly leave it off when once they begin to find the cost of the undertaking. Very often that which is soon ripe is soon rotten. That which comes up in a night perishes in a night, as we see that seed on the rock that suddenly sprung up, suddenly wilted away too. But if this be not your case, but you go on still holding your resolution to cleave to the Lord and to his work, still pressing forward in the way to heaven, it is no matter how suddenly the seed sprung up. But of this I would speak more particularly under another observation, and therefore shall insist no further on it now. Application 2 may be caution to those who have long been under trouble not to conclude their conversion is true merely from that. As sudden conversions may be true, so the conversion of those that are very long seeking may be false. True conversion and long seeking are not necessarily connected together. Many of the children of Israel that long wandered in the wilderness never entered into Canaan. Persons may seek a great while and be long under trouble and yet never be convinced of their own sinfulness and emptiness. Long experience of those things alone won't do it. There must be power of grace accompanying it. Some are ever learning and never coming to the knowledge of the truth, but take up with the devil's delusions and lies instead of the truth at last. If the end of a long wilderness travail is obtained in those that have been but a little while under trouble, and be not obtained in you that have been long under trouble? They are far better than you are. Therefore see whether those ends are obtained, whether you are brought to a thorough sense of sinfulness and emptiness, and whether you are indeed now, after halting so long a time between two opinions, brought wholly to renounce Baal and to receive the Lord as your God, and to give up yourself to him without reserve, having a disposition to cleave to Christ through all difficulties, and follow the Lamb whithersoever he goes. That religion that arises only from superficial impressions is wont to wither away from want of a root when it comes to be tried by the difficulties of religion. Persons that have only superficial impressions do oftentimes appear religious. The seed sown upon a stony ground made some impression. It sank in a little way, and there was some effect. There was a growth from the seed, and the growth, for what it appears, was at first as fair as that which was in good ground, as the lamps of the foolish virgins, for aught appears, burnt as bright for a while as the lamps of the wise virgins. Those whose hearts remain hard as a rock may yet, from superficial impressions made by the word, for a while be reformed. They may live morally, may avoid those wicked practices that they formerly used to indulge themselves in, and may be careful of their behavior amongst men. They may make a fair profession and put on a religious countenance. They may appear serious and devout, and may join with the people of God. May seem to desire their company, as Judas was a great while a companion with the other disciples, and as Ahithophel was a companion with David. See Psalm 55:13 and 14. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide and mine acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together, and walked to the house of God in company, and may seem to be much engaged for a while in religious duties, may be constant in secret prayer, and diligent and strict in attending on ordinances, forward for religious talk, and frequent at private religious meetings, and may show a zeal against sin, and seem zealous for promoting religion. The religion of such as are only superficially impressed is but temporary. The children of Israel had their hearts impressed in the wilderness. They were greatly affected at the Red Sea, and were religious at first. They sang God's praise. But this religion did not hold, for they soon forgot his work. Psalm 106:12 and 13. So their minds were also superficially impressed by God's judgments. When he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and inquired early after God. Psalm 78, verses 34 and 35. They inquired early after God. They were very earnest in religion, but they were not steadfast in God's covenant, as it follows, verse 37. God complains that they were turned aside like a deceitful bow, Psalm 78, verse 57. God complains of Israel that their goodness was as a morning cloud. For your goodness is as a morning cloud, and as the early dew it goes away, Hosea 6, verse 4. The lamps of the foolish virgins burnt for a while. They complain when the bridegroom comes that their lamps were gone out. It was a true proverb that we have in Proverbs 26:11 that the dog returns to his vomit, and so a fool returns to his folly. Many of Christ's disciples that were affected with his preaching and followed him a while, yet afterwards went back and walked no more with him. And so the apostle tells us of some in those days that joined with Christians a while, but then went out from them because they were not of them. John 6, verse 66. It is often mentioned as a distinguishing characteristic of the truly godly, that they should hold on their way, and that they should continue in Christ's word to the end. It is mentioned as a mark of Christ's true servants that he should find them faithfully doing their duty when he comes. Blessed are those servants when his Lord, when he comes, shall find watching. Luke 12:37. There are many difficulties that attend to being thoroughly and perseveringly religious. The Christian religion is not a thing calculated to suit men's carnal inclinations. Indeed, there may be some things in religion that may very well agree with men's natural inclinations, especially in a Christian country, and among a people where religion is much in credit. But everywhere a being universally and perseveringly religious is a thing attended with many difficulties. Hence we read of a narrow way that leads to life, Matthew 7:14. Christ was abundant in signifying to his followers the difficulties that would attend being his disciples. Many of them expected great worldly prosperity by it, being carried away with the Jewish notion of the Messiah's temporal kingdom. But Christ let them know that it was not riches and worldly honors and pleasures that were to be expected in following him, but trouble and contempt, and bearing the cross. He told them that he did not come to send peace on earth, but a sword, and that through much tribulation they must enter into the kingdom of heaven, Acts 14:22. The difficulties that attend of being thoroughly and constantly religious are very many and various. There are many difficult duties to be attended as well as easy. Some duties that are required are difficult to all men as they are by nature. And there are some duties that are easy to some, that are very difficult to others by reason of their particular constitutions and natural tempers, or the particular circumstances. If men might have the liberty of picking and choosing among the commands, yea, if there were only that liberty given that every man might set aside some one particular command, it would be an abundantly easier thing for men to be Christian than it is now. But there is no such liberty given. Let men's natural dispositions or their circumstances be what they will, every command must be obeyed. And there are some seasons abundantly more difficult. They that pretend to be religious, if they live any time in the world, must expect to meet with difficult seasons. At some seasons it is comparatively easy to be religious. The stream seems to run that way. But there are other seasons in which, if we would cleave to Christ and follow him, we must row against the wind and the tide. Commonly those that follow Christ at some times have a smooth and plain way, but they must not expect this always. They must expect to be led through over rocks and mountains and very difficult places. Such men as have only superficial affections, when they set up for saints, as seem to embrace religion, they don't intend to hurt themselves. They are far from making any such bargain as to agree to be religious at the cost of many and great difficulties. Their hearts are never weaned from the world enough for that. They would be religious and would go to heaven, but not to be so cruel to their lusts as to crucify them. They have a mind to show mercy to Achan, and are never persuaded to be willing to burn him and his wife and children and family and all that he has, Joshua 7:24. They may be reformed for a while and may be very obedient, but when difficulties arise, there is an end to their obedience. And commonly it puts an end to their religious affections, their seeming love and zeal. They can be friends to Christ as long as he does well by them as to their temporal interest and natural inclinations, and spares them. But when he comes to require them to part with them, they are out with him and forsake him. They don't feel such affections towards him as they used to do, and a manner of their religious failing is fitly called a withering away in the text. For as the plants that wither by the scorching heat of the sun don't dry at once, but decay by degrees till they are quite dead, so it commonly is with the religion of the stony ground hearers when they meet with difficulties. Their religion doesn't cease at once, but by degrees. The first difficulties they meet with they may bear pretty well, but as they grow more cold, they are more and more discouraged with their strictness and begin to study for excuses, and to find out arguments to justify their neglecting to do such and such a duty, and will plead that it is not their duty, and get more and more into that way till they find out a way to shun everything in religion that has any great manner of difficulty in it, and so return by degrees to a carnal, wicked life. Their religion dies for lack of rooting, which seems naturally to imply that a thorough conviction of the understanding is the root or foundation of all religion. And when men are once thoroughly convinced of the truth and certainty of the great things of religion, and see their superior excellency to all things in this world, that will fix their hearts and settle their minds on religion so that they won't be easily overthrown. It will be like the deep rooting of a plant that will uphold its growth under scorching heat. Yet it will flourish the more for that heat of the sun that dries up the plants that have no root. No wonder that those that never were thoroughly convinced of the truth and certainty of the great things of religion are very unstable in religion. Their religion wants a foundation to stand on. If they haven't a thorough conviction of understanding, it is not to be expected that the will should be steady. Application. In the improvement of this doctrine, I would apply myself to those that are now setting out and seeking their salvation. There are, blessed be God, some amongst us that have lately been in some measure awakened and are beginning to make that inquiry, what shall I do to be saved? The exhortation I would give to such is to count the cost, or fully to consider the difficulties of being thoroughly and steadfastly religious. You have heard that there are many difficulties that attend to being thoroughly religious and continuing strictly in it. If it be so, it is best that you should be aware of it now in the beginning. It is best, when any are going about any piece of work, that they should be sensible of the difficulties of it when they first begin. How many have set out to seek heaven, and have been something awakened and concerned for their salvation as you are, and have seemed to be something engaged for a while, that afterwards, when they have come to find a difficulty of continuing finally in it, have grown discouraged and have failed? And many of them, through that means, have perished, when if they had held on and been willing to go through the difficulties, they might have been saved. Oh, what a pity it is that it should be thus. Now you are something awakened. Now God's Spirit is in some measure striving with you, and you have begun to seek salvation and have a good opportunity to obtain. What a pity it is that you should fail of it, and after you have sought a while fall back and sink down into the dreadful pit, for lack of pressing forward through the difficulties of religion. The reason why many that set out soon fail is because they don't consider what they are going about. They enter upon the business without considering the difficulties that attend it, and so they aren't prepared for them. There are some now in this congregation that formerly began as you are. They were concerned and they sought a while and intended to get salvation, but since that they have backslidden and returned to their vomit and wallowing in the mire. And let their own consciences speak and declare whether this was not the case, whether when they set out it was not without any expectation of, or preparation for, the difficulties of a constant striving for salvation to the end of their lives, without any expectation of any occasion for it, whether or not they did not enter upon the business, hoping soon to get through with it, and so being in a great measure done with the labor and toil of it. Therefore I would warn you, that are now setting out to avoid those rocks upon which others have split. Now you are going about a great piece of work. Now is the time for you to count the cost and consider the difficulties of it. If you begin to build a tower, it is best you should know what the work is that you have to do. You have a mind to get to heaven, but don't flatter yourself that it shall be easy. It is no such easy thing. It is probable you haven't imagined 1/4 of the difficulty of it. This business is the greatest that ever you undertook in your lives. It is probable you think it is only for you to pray and read and do some other such things for a few months, and then you shall be converted. And then after that all will be done, all the work will be over, and you may sit down and take your rest, having no more to do. But if those are your thoughts, they show you to be very ignorant of the matter, and that you have strange notions about the way of getting to heaven. Religion is not such an easy business as you imagine. The way to heaven is quite a different way from that which you have laid out. You are like the children of Israel when they set out from Egypt to go to Canaan. They seemed to think of nothing but only resting from their Egyptian bondage, and that they should go to the land of Canaan and there should live at ease, but thought nothing of the great difficulties they were to meet with for 40 years in the wilderness. If you would be successful in your present seeking, you must consider what it will be from this day forward to take your last leave of all your lusts and all your former ways of sin and vanity, and to deny yourself and seek and strive and pray and wrestle all the days of your life. It may be just now you are pretty diligent, but consider what it will be to never abate at all of your diligence as long as you live, but to strive and press forward to the end of your days, and rather increasing more and more than abating your diligence and doing difficult duties as well as easy ones, and giving up your whole life to this great work. What do you think of this? Can you comply with it? Are you willing to give up all the remaining part of your life to this service? This is the tower you have to build. Can you find it in your heart to be at the cost of it? If you aren't willing to comply with this, it is not worth your while to pretend to seek salvation. The best way is either to do thus, or you can dismiss all thoughts of going to heaven, contending that way to it is so difficult that it is not worth your while to go the difficulties for it. You hope to be converted in a little time, but if you are, you must not expect to have done with labor and striving because you are converted. And if you are truly converted, you won't desire it. Whoever is a true convert is made willing to be at the difficulty of a laborious, thorough, constant, perpetual seeking, and serving God as long as he lives. He that doesn't have such a heart as this is not a true convert. Therefore, if you would be successful in seeking salvation, this is a way for you now to think of the difficulties and come to a determination whether you will comply with them or not. If you will, in all probability, you will obtain. And if you're not willing, it is not worth your while to pretend to anything at all. This has been a reading of Jonathan Edwards, A Seed That Fell into Stony Ground. Sudden conversions are often false.